The gala was meant to be like every other elite gathering, filled with sparkling chandeliers, flowing champagne, and the endless chatter of people who measured worth by the size of their portfolios. Yet all of that shimmer lost its weight when he walked in. The giant cowboy, his boots clicking against marble floors polished to perfection, drew every pair of eyes in the room. He wasn't dressed in sleek tuxedos like the rest, nor did he carry himself with the pretentious ease of those born into privilege. He carried himself like a man who knew storms, who had walked through dust and fire, who had been bruised by life yet refused to bow. His hat shadowed part of his rugged face, but his eyes, piercing and tired, scanned the room not for approval but for truth. People whispered. Some laughed quietly into their champagne glasses, mocking his rough edges in a room of silk and gold. He knew it. He had felt it all his life. Yet he stood taller than the tallest chandelier, commanding respect without asking for it. She saw him before anyone else dared to. The wealthy woman with diamonds resting effortlessly on her collarbones, a gown that swept the floor, and lips painted in defiance of vulnerability. She had everything one could dream of: money, fame, influence, but inside she felt a gnawing emptiness that no gala, no applause, no billion-dollar empire could cure. Her eyes found his like a compass suddenly struck by true north. She whispered under her breath, almost like a confession to herself, "Too big for me, but I'll try." It wasn't about his size, though he was a towering figure that dwarfed even the tallest men in the room. It was about the enormity of his spirit, the depth of his silence, the kind of man who had been hardened not by money but by fire. She couldn't stop looking, even as the crowd smirked at the oddity of a cowboy standing among titans of wealth. The truth was, he didn't want to be there. He had been dragged into this room of crystal and arrogance because someone in power thought it would be amusing, a game to place the rugged outsider among the pristine elite. But games have a way of backfiring, especially when hearts and histories collide. She rose from her table, ignoring the hush that fell across the crowd as diamonds clinked against champagne glasses. People whispered about her, wondering why someone of her stature would waste time on a man like him. She ignored them all, her steps echoing like a rebellion as she walked toward him. He stood unmoving, a pillar among people who had never known the taste of struggle. When she reached him, the air thickened. She whispered again, softer this time, like a vow, "Too big for me, but I'll try." He finally looked at her, truly looked, and in that silent gaze was a world of stories untold, loss, battles, endurance, and a strange kind of gentleness that no one else in the room had eyes sharp enough to see. He was a cowboy who had built his life out of dust and heartbreak, a man who had faced rejection his entire life, not for lack of worth, but because he was never willing to bend to the shallow judgments of others. And here was a woman who had lived her entire life surrounded by people who bent too easily, whose spines melted when money spoke. She saw in him not just a man, but the mirror of something she had long forgotten: authenticity. But the world doesn't let love, or even connection, bloom so easily. Laughter rippled through the gala, sharp and cutting, as if the crowd couldn't stomach the sight of the billionaire's daughter and the giant cowboy standing together. They whispered words like charity case and novelty, while sipping drinks worth more than most families' yearly earnings. She knew the ridicule would follow her if she dared to pursue what she felt in that moment, yet for the first time in years she didn't care. He shifted slightly, adjusting the brim of his hat, a small gesture of discomfort at the eyes boring into him. But she reached out, gently touching his arm, grounding him, anchoring him against the storm of judgment. He had stories in his silence, but he wasn't sure the world was ready to hear them. He wasn't even sure if she was ready. Yet there she stood, her wealth, her empire, her reputation all hanging by a thread, whispering to him a promise she didn't yet understand fully. He looked down at her, his voice low and gravelly, carrying the weight of 1,000 miles traveled. And in that single breath of silence before words, the entire gala froze, waiting for what would come next. What none of them knew was that this meeting would unravel everything they thought they knew about power, worth, and love. If you believe in kindness, in the power of second chances, and in the courage it takes to step beyond society's shallow judgments, then pause here and take a moment to comment, share, and subscribe to Echo Tales. Every story we tell carries a seed of truth, and by supporting it, you help plant those seeds in hearts that need them most. But this was only the beginning. What started as whispers of a gala would soon become a battle of worlds colliding, as the wealthy woman and the giant cowboy found themselves walking a path neither had expected, where every step tested the strength of their hearts and the depth of their resolve. The crowd expected the moment to collapse under the weight of mockery, for her to retreat back to her world of diamonds and polished glass, leaving the cowboy to stand alone in his silence. But she did not step back. She leaned closer, her voice steady now, no longer just a whisper but a declaration only he and she could hear. "You are more than they'll ever understand." He studied her, his eyes narrowing, not with suspicion but with the kind of caution that comes from a lifetime of being let down. He had been used before, toyed with, laughed at by people who thought his size and silence made him an easy target. But there was something in her gaze, not pity, not curiosity, but recognition. It unsettled him more than the laughter around them. A server passed with champagne, and someone muttered loudly, "Careful, he might crush the glass with those hands." The laughter stung the air, sharp and humiliating. He shifted his weight, preparing to walk out of the suffocating ballroom, but her hand tightened on his arm, keeping him still. Her eyes burned into his unflinching, daring him to believe that she meant every word. "Stay," she said softly, almost pleading. "Don't give them the satisfaction of watching you walk away." That one word, stay, hit him harder than 100 insults. No one had ever asked him to stay. The evening blurred with shallow conversations and clinking glasses, but in the corner of the grand hall stood two figures bound by something no one else could name. She asked him questions, not about money, not about business, but about him, his life, his land, his struggles. At first, his answers were short-guarded, but the more she listened, truly listened, the more the fortress around his heart began to crumble. She learned he had lost a brother in a rodeo accident, that he worked the ranch alone, sun up to sundown, carrying not only the weight of the land, but also the grief of unfinished goodbyes. She learned he carried letters from his mother folded neatly in his wallet, words that reminded him of roots that no storm could wash away. She told him about her world too, though it was painted in gold. It was hollow. She confessed how people only saw her wealth, never her heart. Men pursued her name, her money, but none dared to love her with the kind of raw honesty she craved. When she spoke of sleepless nights and the gnawing emptiness that grew louder in silence, his eyes softened, recognizing a loneliness that mirrored his own. They were two people from opposite worlds, yet bound by the same wound. Misunderstood by the crowds around them. By midnight, the laughter of others no longer mattered. What mattered was the way she leaned in when he spoke, the way his eyes lit up when she laughed, the way the air seemed lighter when they forgot the gala and remembered they were simply human. But as every fairy tale meeting has its test, theirs arrived swiftly. A man in a tailored suit, her business partner and long-time suitor, stormed across the floor with a sneer stretched across his face. "You're embarrassing yourself," he hissed at her. "Dragging our name through the mud for a circus act in boots." His voice was venom, but his words carried the truth of what many in the room were thinking. The cowboy straightened, not with anger but with a dignity that silenced the sneer in an instant. He didn't fight back with words. He didn't need to. His silence was a weapon stronger than arrogance. But she did not stay silent. She lifted her chin, her voice like steel wrapped in velvet. "I'd rather stand with a man who has built his life with his own hands than sit beside cowards who measure worth by numbers on a screen." The room froze, gasps echoing against the gilded ceiling. No one spoke to her like that before. No one defied the unwritten rules of their golden cage. And yet she had, because for the first time in years she saw what mattered. The suitor stormed off, muttering about ruined deals and reputations. The crowd whispered louder than ever, scandal dripping from every corner of the room, but she no longer heard them. She turned back to the cowboy, her eyes brimming with something she had long buried. Hope. He looked at her, shaking his head slightly. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly. But she smiled, a smile that cracked through years of loneliness. "Yes," she whispered back. "I did. The night ended not with fireworks or grand gestures, but with a quiet walk beneath the starlit sky outside the ballroom. Away from the chandeliers, the laughter, and the judgmental eyes, the world felt real again. He tipped his hat slightly, a gesture of respect and hesitation. "You don't belong in my world," he said softly. "And I don't belong in yours." She stepped closer, her gown brushing against his boots, her voice trembling but firm. "Maybe that's the point. Maybe together we'll find a world that belongs to us both." For a long moment, he said nothing. His eyes traced the stars, the vastness above, the same sky he had stared at from his ranch countless nights, searching for answers. Then, slowly, he looked back at her, his jaw tightening, his heart daring to believe. He wasn't sure how or if it would last, but for the first time he felt the possibility of something greater than loneliness. And she finally felt alive, not because of the diamonds she wore or the empire she owned, but because of the man who saw her not as wealth, not as power, but simply as a woman who wanted to be known. Their story wouldn't be easy. The world would mock them, test them, try to break what they were building. But in that moment, as she whispered once more, "Too big for me, but I'll try," he understood something he never had before. Sometimes love isn't about fitting perfectly. Sometimes it's about daring to try when the world tells you it's impossible. And so, under the quiet night sky, the giant cowboy and the wealthy woman began a story no gala could ever contain. This was their beginning, and though the road ahead was uncertain, one truth rang louder than every whisper in that ballroom: when two souls recognize each other in a world built on lies, that bond is stronger than wealth, stronger than ridicule, stronger than fear. And that is the story of the giant cowboy and the woman who dared to whisper against the world. This is Echo Tales, where every story carries the heartbeat of truth.